In this part of our video notes, we're going to be modeling one-to-one relationships. In the next videos, in the playlist linked below the like button, we're going to be verifying the one-to-one implementation, and then we're also going to look at modeling one-to-many and then many-to-many relationships. So for this one, we're just going to be modeling the one-to-one. So this is modeling relationships between various entities. Soon, we will set relation between department and employee. Again, we'll do this soon. First, we're going to look at how to set this new class up where we have employee contact info, and we're going to use this with a relationship. So inside of our employee contact info, we have our ID, and this is marked as the identifier for our long ID. This is a type. Then we have our private string address, private string phone number, nothing special there. What is special is this part right here. So we can see that we have this first part, and this is going to tell us that the nature of our relationship between employee contact info and employee is 1-to-1. This represents contact details for our employee, this entire class. The relationship should be 1-to-1, meaning for every one employee, there is only one contact information for that employee. So if we have one employee, there should only have one contact for that. So inside of our employee contact info, we are going to set our fetch type to lazy. When we access an instance of our employee, the contact info, we will automatically not have it populate with the related employee, only when we ask for it. This can be done using like a getter method. So it's not automatically going to give us what we want, we have to ask for it. Now, there is a way to do this with it automatically being fetched. The lazy way is more efficient though, since fewer computations are needed to be carried out when accessing an instance. There is an eager fetching where entities will be automatically fetched for us though. So this is our 1-to-1 because it's 1-to-1, and we set our fetch equal to the fetch type lazy. Next we have our maps ID. Maps ID makes sure that this is modeled in the most efficient way. And make sure this maps to the primary entity of our employee key and serves as the primary key of our employee contact info entity. These now share a primary key and is more efficient to model a one-to-one relationship. So this ID is going to be our key that it shares. We can see that in this constructor, we're not going to need our ID or our employee, as they're going to be combined with our annotations and reference the employee entity. Then we have getters and setters. Then we are going to have our toString method, and that's just to print down here. Now inside of our employee.java, which we've had before, we're going to rename our job to role. So this was previously private string role, or private string job. Now we want it to be private string role, and we have to go through our code and we have to change everything that was job into role. And we could do like a control, like replace, control F, find, replace to do so, or we could just go in through manually. So all of this we've had before. What is new is this part right here, and this is our 1-to-1 part. When we look at this, it's mapped by our employee. Now notice how we have our contact info, and we're just storing in contact info. That means this contact info is going to go into this Java class. And inside of this Java class, we can see that we have a employee right here. So this employee contact info is referencing our employee, and our employee is referencing the employee contact info. So inside of here, we have our mapped by employee. We have our cascade, and that's equal to cascade type dot all. So we're setting our cascade type, and it determines what happens to a reference entity when we update it from our parent entity. Then we're setting our fetch type, again it's to lazy. Then we set our optional. We set it to true, meaning we don't need the employee contact info to run this. Now we also have to take care of exception handling. This is done a little bit lower. Nothing else needs to change here. So if we scroll down, we have this part right here, set contact info. And it's a lot going on here, but we're going to go over it. So inside of here, we have a public void set contact info. We're setting the contact info for our employee. So we're passing in type employee contact info, and we're passing in the contact info. Now, if our contact info is null, meaning that what we're passing here, if there's nothing inside of here, we want to check if this .contact info is not null. So we want to check if the contact info we currently have is or is not null. Now, if it is null, that means we're going to set our employee to be null, because we don't want any kind of just like dangling entities. Now we have this .contact info, meaning this is referencing this contact info right here, the one we're passing in, and we're going to set the employee relating to this to be null. Otherwise, if contact info is not null, and this is the one that's passed in here, if it's not null, we're going to do contact info dot set employee, and then we're setting it to this. Once we're done with this, we are going to always set this, so this employee's contact info to the contact info we're passed in. And that's going to be it for modeling our one-to-one relationships. Believe that we're going to be using this when we look through our verifying the one-to-one implementation, and then looking over modeling one-to-many relationships and also modeling many-to-many relationships. So we just set up our modeling one-to-one, and we're going to do a quick verification of it. So this is verification for the one-to-one implementation. Now I made an error right here. When I was doing the if statements, I need to have these brackets, since we have this if statement and then this inside of our outer if statement right here. So just make sure that you have all of this correctly written out right here. You have this else here, and then you have this contact. I believe that was the only mistake. If I had any more, this is just an override down here. These are just our getters and setters. I do believe I actually had one more. So in our employee, I think this was an int ID. This needs to be a long ID. So I was just going through debugging everything. And the reason why it needs to be a long ID is because in our employee contact info, this is a long ID here. And since it's the identifier, it's the key, they need to match each other. So once they match each other, we can go into our application and we can run this. Now, inside of our application, I did a few things. So we're changing a little bit in here. The first thing that we're going to be doing is we are going to make our employee contact info. We're going to make it for 1, 2, and 3 employees. So these are for 3 different employees right here. This is their contact info. And then we just make the employees right here. And then we have our first employee.set contact info, and then we're setting all of these right here. Notice in our employee right here, in our actual fields, we have this private employee contact info called contact info. So we're actually going to be getting this entire class and storing it in our contact info. We talked about that when we were doing this if-else statement right here. So it's all stored inside of there, so we're just passing this in, and it's going to relate. Then we're going to do this .persist, and we want to persist our first employee, second employee, and third employee into our database. And the same thing, we want to do this for ECI 1, 2, and 3. And then we're just going to print these out, right? So we have select our ED from employee ED, and this is just like a select. We're selecting a specific thing from our employee table, from our database. And we have this print statement, so we can print to our console so we can see what we're doing. Again, this is a list, and then we have this for loop. And then we're going to do the same exact thing before our contact info. Now, let's run it. So I'll go back down here, so just so you can see all of this listing, all of our persisting, and our adding. And so we can pull this up. Now, the first time you run this, you might get an error at the top, and that's just because our foreign key, we need to, I think, drop and like re-initialize it because it's non-existent the first time. But we can scroll down, we can see that we drop the tables if they exist, and then we're going to create our tables. So we create all of them right here. Notice how we have our primary keys. So we have multiple keys here. We have primary keys, employee ID, and entry date. This is for employee entry. We're not looking at this in this video. It's just something to note. That was covered previously in the playlist link below the like button. In our employee table, we have our primary key as our ID. Now let's look at our employee contact info. We see it's employee underscore ID. So it's from the employee class, and it's our ID here. We can scroll down a little bit. We have our selects, we have our updates, select, updates, and these are for our hibernates. And these are just selecting and updating. And then we have our hibernates where we're inserting. So these are going to be all of these right here where we're inserting into our employee table. We can see that first. We do our employee, then we do our employee contact info, employee, employee contact info, employee, employee contact info, and then we have the select here where we're selecting our first name, our last name, of course our ID, the role, and salary. And this is from our employee 0. And then we're just going to print this out. Now this does this for every employee, so we can see that we have this employee here, and this employee right here. So these are going to be our lists that we're dealing with. If we go back in here, we can see that if we go to our toString method, we have our employee ID. So we have employee ID 1, ID 2, and ID 3. It's doing this for every single thing. And that's how that would look. We then have our hibernate where we select from here. This is from our employee contact info. I don't think this has anything specifically to do with what we're looking at. We want to look at from this part right here. So from employee or from employee contact info. And so from employee contact info, we're going to get our defaulted to string right here where we print out our employee contact info. So we have our ID, address, phone number, and then we have employee, which we know is going to relate to our employee.java. In our employee.java, we just have employee is equal to, and then we print out everything that we had up here. So that's how we would verify our one-to-one relationship. Pretty cool. We've done a lot. And now we're going to look at our modeling one-to-many relationships and modeling many-to-many relationships. But that'll be in the next video in the playlist linked below the like button. And then we're going to be doing a conclusion for this material. Now we are in our MySQL. I have all of this loaded up here. If we do the show create table employee, we run this really quickly, we can open the value right here, and we can see that we have everything that we set to be inside of here. We have our primary key is ID, make sure ID is not null. Now let's run this for our contact info. We're going to get something very similar, except we don't have our ID inside of here. We only have address, phone number, and employee. But employee cannot be null, because that has to deal with our primary key, and that's for the employee ID. Then we have our constraints here. We have our foreign key listed as the employee ID, and the reference is employee for the ID. Now let's run our employee. We can see we have all the employees that we added, and then we could also run our employee contact infos, and we can see it's all the contact infos. So that's how it would look inside of our database.